What's going on, everybody? And welcome into the 114th episode of the CRZY podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates, and this is the show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and everything else that helps to empower creative people. Now, you can listen to all the shows, get the show notes, and a whole lot more if you just head over to thecrazy1.com. It's the words the crazy and the number 1.com. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform to get the latest episodes whenever those come out. And while you're there, do me a favor, take just a couple seconds and leave a review to let people know what you think about the show. The CRZY One is also now on YouTube. I've been doing a whole bunch of videos that are around career coaching, tutorials, masterclasses. You can see past keynotes. So there again, just head over to thecrazy1.com/YouTube and you can subscribe to a whole bunch of content there. Now, as always, if you have any questions, want to keep up to date with, I think, thanks to the vaccine, what will hopefully be my increasing adventures, you can always follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and you can follow the show either on LinkedIn or Facebook. Well, it's been a minute since last we talked, so hi, remember me? I know it's been a minute since the last episode. Sorry about that, and we sort of have been on hiatus for a couple months. Honestly, I think that it was just sort of one of these things where after, probably almost 5 years, it would be 5 years in July of making the show, I think I honestly just needed a bit of a break. I think part of that was driven by starting a new job, was just, sort of driven by a lot of different things, last year being a long and difficult one, where I think I just needed a little bit of time to sort of sort things out and get my head straight. But the good news is, starting to find the rhythm again. I think that break gave me time to think about a lot of new topics that I want to be able to discuss on here. So look, I'm going to be doing my best to sort of get back in the groove, get back in the rhythm, and start putting out shows on a more regular basis. So thanks for rolling through that little hiatus. Now, I also use that time, I think, to do a lot of self-reflection and thinking about, really what have I been seeing across the industry over the past year? What have I been experiencing? And I want to talk about one of those things today, because I think in that sort of time off, I've been talking to a lot of friends, a lot of colleagues, a lot of different things. I think as we talked about in the last episode, talking about the job market, there's a lot of people on the move. And so it's been interesting to have conversations about why. Now, we've talked before about how important understanding things like trust and imposter syndrome are to your creativity and career, especially if you do anything creative. And I just really want to revisit this area because I think the pandemic, honestly, has sort of grown and magnified how people have been struggling with some of these issues. And I think these issues have been there for honestly a really long time. But I think the difference is that we've all been forced into a huge amount of change over the past year. And that change can create really good things and create really good growth. But I think it can also start to manifest some bad things. And that can happen in both people and companies because change isn't comfortable. There isn't always a blueprint. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm seeing manifesting in a lot of people where they see the opportunity, they see there's all this change going on, is that it's starting to manifest in fear. I think, honestly, a lot of deep-seated fear. Because I think in people, fear can do a lot of things that is difficult, especially when you're creative, because we all are just sort of naturally insecure. Whenever you create anything new, that's sort of the cost of admission. But I think whenever you get into fear, as imposter syndrome or a lot of these other things, you can start to doubt your next decision. You can start to feel really overwhelmed. You can start to lose your way. As a leader, you can start to become ineffective or just not sure what's going on. And I think a lot of these sort of things are leading people either through enlightenment or just wanting a change to start to change jobs right now. But I think fear also manifests in companies as well, especially at a time like this where companies are going through a lot of change, where you can start to see people be unsure of what to do. You start to see a whole lot of groupthink break out, the inability to really think about new things, that all of a sudden politics and panic and burnout and all these things are just running rampant. Now, I think the obvious question would be, right, like if this is such a widespread problem, why don't we talk about it more? Why isn't it more widely understood? And I think because honestly, for a lot of us, it's hard to say I don't understand something, I'm not good at something, that I'm struggling with something, especially in the age of social media or the time when we're even more disconnected from each other. And I think it's because, when we don't know what's going on or we don't know how to break the cycle, we sort of get stuck. And that usually in that moment, that's when the fear starts to grow a little bit. So what I want to do in this episode is I want to look at the reasons why fear and self-doubt grow in people and in companies. I want to look at, actually, there are different types of things that I think people fear that I've seen through the coaching that I've done. So I want to talk about how does that usually manifest. And then for each one of those and for a few other things, I actually wanted to look at what are some of the ways I think not only can you recognize it, but you can start to fight it. But so I think for me, the interesting part to start with all this is, why is it worse lately? Because I think if we step back, I think fear is often that result of a breakdown in confidence or trust. And I think we arrive at that fear from a lot of different directions. And I think it can and will happen at any stage of your life or your career. And I think it's particularly important that we don't skip over that last point too quickly. Because I often think that there's this perception that as you move on in your career, the more senior you get, or as you become a leader, you suddenly have everything figured out. Now, I've talked about in the past how I really don't think that's true. And it's this sort of inverse expectation that a lot of us have, where as we go on, we get the bigger job, we get more responsibility, that somehow we're supposed to have it all figured out. And I don't think that's what happens at all, because for a lot of different reasons, as you tend to progress, you aren't networking quite the way you used to because you got the job that you wanted. There's more expectations from leaderships. You don't want to look weak or look, like you don't know what you're doing to them. As you start to build a team and get into leadership, well, they're looking to you for answers. You can't quite go to them. The problems become more complicated. There are fewer people you know how to talk to about it. All of these things start compounding. And again, a lot of this for me really goes back to the best advice or the best description I ever had around leadership, or just doing anything creative, is it often boils down to your willingness to be the most confident, uncertain person. Well, I think that, over the past year, that all of those things that normally we would struggle with, the pandemic has focused those. And I think in a few too many people, it's made them worse, because normally we struggle with these things. We are at least surrounded by more people, or we could watch them, observe them. You can see their body language. You can have different conversations. And I think it often tends to ease those fears or those feelings somewhat, because it gives us one really important thing that you don't get whenever you do remote work, which is context. Meaning that we can't see how people are doing or how we're doing compared to other people. We can't watch their body language or have that conversation or say, hey, how are you doing? You tend to just be able to get people in 30 to 60-minute chunks presented in this little Zoom window. And I think often it's fairly easy to make that into more than a little bit of a performance. Of it looks good and everybody's happy and everybody's focused. And, we tend to just dive right in and just, sort of get to work. We don't leave much time for personal space or connection because we have to be a lot more deliberate about it. And that's hard. It's often not a skill that people are sort of used to, being deliberately human. And I think that what that does to all of us is when we don't get that context, I think we often then have growing doubt. And that doubt becomes uncertainty. The certainty becomes imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome becomes fear. And I think it's just worth recognizing that, those are the things, while maybe you're feeling better at sort of being on Zoom, or you're feeling better at being remote or doing what some of those things are, that I think for a lot of us, we have changed, and sort of what those insecurities are and what those things are a bit different. Now, I think that, for me, through the conversations I've had, for the people who reach out over email, the people through the Amazing Design People List, which I still absolutely love being a part of, to be able to give mentoring to different people, I think you start to be able to recognize patterns. And there's a few patterns that I see in, honestly, people of all stages of their career that I think often are the root of where a lot of this fear, a lot of this uncertainty comes from. And I think it manifests itself into sort of 6 different ways. And now I think to be able to understand this, the first is the fact that you need to understand that having a problem is not the problem. We all do. We all are struggling with things. We all are uncertain of what to do. It's sort of, how do we respond to it? How do we react to it? That often is the difference. And so I think that ability to understand it and how it may be affecting you is important to look at in yourself. And I think how these things could apply to you. But I think it also is a really useful tool to see how does it manifest in other people. Because I think that's often what we all often do a little bit too easily, is that we demonize other people. We look at that weakness, we look at that uncertainty, and we try to pounce on it. We try to take advantage of it. We try to advance our agenda because of it. And I don't think great work or great teamwork comes out of that whenever you're sort of having that kind of small and opportunistic approach to things. So let's just take a minute and look at these sort of 6 different dimensions, because I think that it's something I know that we sort of have worked my way through all of these, and I think a lot of other people have too. I'm just not sure a lot of people have really realized what it actually is or being able to put their finger on it. Now, I think the first fear that I see a lot, which we've talked about and why it has an entire syndrome named after it, is the fear of being seen as an imposter. Because I think if you secretly feel that you really, aren't good enough or smart enough, first off, you're not alone. Every creative feels that way. And I think we all go through this. And honestly, I think the bigger the change, the newer the thing, the more this will try to creep in. Now, it's a little bit of a trick, though, because I think in many cases, our brain sort of wants you to stay away from doing something new that, I'm going to get laughed at. It's not going to be good. But I think really the learning we want, the growth we need, those sort of things, I think often sits on the other side of dealing with something like that. Now, if you're listening to the show for the first time, or you sort of aren't really sure what imposter syndrome is, I would encourage you to go check out episode 69, because that goes into all types of detail on the 5 different types of imposter syndrome and a lot more detail if you haven't explored that yet. But I think whenever it comes to, honestly, to just sort of being that imposter, I found that the fear of what might happen is almost always bigger than what does happen. Because I think in many cases, and we'll get to this a little bit more in a minute, I think we're really good at starting to construct these narratives of how will somebody judge it? How are we viewed? We often give our insecurities the voice of someone else. What will our boss think? What will our team think? What will my parents think? What will my spouse think? But we don't often actually give them the chance to have the conversation or to have the reaction. We sort of try to pre-populate it. And so I think, one of the things that I do to be able to fight that imposter syndrome is, instead of just fearing what could be or letting that insecurity win, just let it fly and see what happens. I don't know that anybody thought that, hey, you know what, we need another big redheaded guy to go speak on stage, or the world needs another podcast, or any of the things that I've done. And I think, there are times when, sure, I could have let the fear win there, let the doubt win there, but I think instead it's just like, great, how do we go try it and see what happens? So I think in a lot of cases with imposter syndrome, for me, see what the actual reaction is instead of sort of what do you think the reaction will be. Now, often with imposter syndrome, I think comes the next one, is that really a fear of being a failure. Because I think we often think in absolutes, which is interesting, because we'll often think of something as being good or bad, a success or a failure. But creativity doesn't deal in absolutes, and it's a process of trying to figure things out. So there's a sort of a lot of shades of gray between the two extremes. And for a lot of the people that I talk to, I think we get into trouble when we take a process like that, that's about learning, and think that we have to succeed, be good, be positive, do whatever it is at every step. Because the reality is, it isn't going to happen. And I think whenever it doesn't happen, whenever you go through and something doesn't work, or you need to pivot, or you need to back up or rethink, we become our own biggest enemies, because we encounter what is a natural part of the process. And by not getting something right, great, that's called creativity. Creativity is learning, iterating, and doing those sort of things. But what happens is that we are trying to hold ourselves to this impossible standard that we have to get it. We can't be a failure. I have to get it right out of the gate, or every single time. And that's just not going to happen. I think you have to remember that this is a process that is about progress and learning. And as long as you are doing those things, you are not going to fail. I think you only fail if you give up in that process. If you're willing to go through, to keep learning, to keep doing all of that, then you're going to be fine. And that, sort of that fear of failure to stop, to not to want to go on, sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So on the imposter syndrome, let it fly and see what happens. But then if you feel like you're going to fail, keep going. Because that's the thing, is maybe you don't get it right the first time. Maybe you don't get it right the second time, or the fourth time, or the fifth time, or the 10th time. But it's that ability to keep getting up and keep trying. That's what's going to overcome that fear, to prove to yourself that there is a way to be able to do it. Now, obviously, I think the other thing that's buried in all of this is a fear of criticism. Because whenever you do something new, whenever you create something, I think facing criticism, or feedback, probably more accurately, is something that's going to happen. And here again, I think that how we look at this internally makes a really big difference. Because I think often we create criticism of what we think people will say without actually letting them say it. Now, in a lot of cases, I think it also is an issue where criticism means someone doesn't like it, where they are harsh on it, where they judge you on it. And I think, in many cases, and at least for me, part of how I hear something makes the difference between criticism and feedback. Because I think you need to get to a place where you see it as feedback, not as criticism. Because for me, feedback is a part of the process. Feedback is a conversation. That's something I can work with. That's something that I want. I want people to break my ideas. Criticism, I think, is often a one-way negative conversation. If you think about a movie critic, a theater critic, right? Like, these are somebody who goes in, watches something, and then renders a verdict, either in a star rating, a number, they write a review. It's a one-way conversation. And I think for the vast majority of us and what it is we do, this is not a one-way conversation. And so I think, try to remove, even in your own mind, the stigma of what is criticism, that it is judgment, that it is, because a lot of it for me is to take that on board, to listen to it, to ask questions, to see if you agree with it or not, but to make it more of a conversation as opposed to a final judgment. And I think even just the ability to do that goes a really long way in helping your mindset, because I think that's the thing that I've seen in myself and with a lot of other people, is that it's often these internal narratives that we construct about how do we perceive information, how do we take it on, and the assumptions we make, that I think often really can cloud the issue or to make it harder on us than what it actually is. But that being said, I think that there are times whenever there are real external forces, whenever there's something that really needs to happen. And I think one of the big ones that I know I've struggled with and others has been the fear of making hard decisions or saying hard things. There have been more than a few teams that I have worked with, especially whenever they reside in certain parts of the country or things like that, of the Midwest or the South or other things like that, where I think hard decisions and hard conversations create a lot of fear for a good reason. Because I think, first off, that it is something important, or that it's going to have an impact, that maybe a project is going the wrong way. Maybe somebody isn't performing the way that they want. Maybe somebody's having an adverse impact on somebody else, right? Like, these are not going to be easy things to say. And I think this is often the root, in this fear in particular, the root of why change is so hard. Because in many cases, it's easier to do the easier thing, to not say it, to just let it go, to just sort of, I don't know what, just sort of let it float by and let it be somebody else's problem. Well, I think often the majority of the reason why we do that is because when you get into a tough conversation, whenever you get into having to face this fear, I think you rarely have a reference point to know if you're making a good decision or if you're taking the right approach, which only makes it harder. The first time you speak up, the first time you object, the first time you push back, right? These are things where I don't think it's an understatement to say for some people in some places, they feel like they may actually be risking their job to say something like this, to be able to push back or ask a question, that sometimes the stakes really do get into that place. And I think because of that, I'm not going to pretend that there's an easy answer on this one. But look, I think whenever it comes to hard decisions or to be able to have a hard conversation with something, the thing that I really try to do is to ground it in more than the opinion that is just running around in my head. To do some research, to ask other people for their opinion. Don't take on that burden alone. To see if there's a blind spot in your thinking, because I think whenever you have to do something like this, you want to make sure that you feel like, again, you aren't just flying off the handle. And in often cases, I think the other reason why those conversations are good is to make sure that there isn't emotion or a personal perspective or something there that may be clouding the issue. Because I think sometimes emotion, politics, different things like that, can really start to get in the way. Because I think when it comes to the hard conversation, the thing that I always try to remember is that if I think about a hard decision or hard conversation, one, if I'm sure that I am taking emotion and taking sort of those things out of it, if I'm trying to stick to the facts, that if I do it, because a lot of it for me is to really think about if the roles were reversed. And if somebody had to tell me something that was really difficult, or if they had to make a hard decision that affected me, whenever I look back on those moments, I think that the ones that I'm okay with, even if I really don't like the hard conversation, maybe I don't like the feedback, maybe I don't like whatever it is, I at least respect that they were honest with me and that they didn't let the fear win. Because the conversations that I do get upset about, the conversations that I do regret or whatever it is, are the ones whenever I could tell that somebody let the fear win. So they tried to sugarcoat it. They tried to spin it. They tried to bullshit me. They tried to... They wouldn't just simply face that fear or face the uncomfortable moment, to just be honest and human. And I think for me that is the best way that I know to overcome that fear, is to be honest and human. Now, I think that the other part of this then comes into, as we talk about honest and human, I think the next fear, which is an interesting one, is I think a lot of people fear not taking responsibility. Because I think, if you watched any superhero movie, you hear those phrases, right? Like, with great power comes great responsibility. Now, I think a lot of us want to take responsibility. A lot of us want to be honest. A lot of us want to be more vulnerable and to be able to do these sort of things. But I really think that, honestly, in many cases, especially whenever we feel like, we're going to be pressed into a corner on some of these things, that we want to be better than maybe we turn out to be. That, we wish we were more honest. We wish we would stand up more. We wish that there was a version of us that we really wanted to be, but in the moment, sometimes we struggle to rise to that. And I think that it really is about, how do we find support or accountability or doing those sort of things, that there is something whenever it comes to that moment, whenever it comes to these moments of facing fear, that we do take on that responsibility. We do take on that accountability. Now, maybe that's something that you work on internally. Maybe it's something where you get an accountability buddy or doing something like that. Because, again, I think that ultimately is probably the biggest ultimate unspoken fear in all of this, is that whether it's the imposter syndrome, that we're going to be a failure, that we're going to be criticized, whether it's around a hard decision or taking responsibility, I think a lot of this ladders up to that for many of us. I think the fear is just that we're not going to accomplish or achieve or just simply get it done. Because I think that as we look at this, there are 100 millions of distractions and excuses and a lot of these other things that's easy to be fearful of. It's easy to blame other people. It's easy to blame a syndrome. It's easy to do all of these things. But I think that whenever we do that, the problem is that then we let the fear win, because we stop focusing on ourselves. We stop focusing on results. We stop focusing on progress. And then we start to focus and concentrate on the actions of other things. And I think that for me, the only way to be able to face some of these fears is to look at yourself first. It's going to be easier to blame your company, to blame a process, blame your boss, blame your coworker. Again, this is not the first time we have talked about, there will always be a them. So I think a lot of this is, as it comes to fear, is that it isn't about them. Now, for me, though, there is sort of a brief moment as we looked at how do we start to take this on, is that, okay, if it's not about them and it's about you, that I think that for me, I know that, again, part of what I did was to sit down and think about, as I looked at my role in this, what are the things that I do, or what are the things that I tell myself, or what are the things that I think often set these problems up? What are the things that I really need to watch out for? Or the things that I think sort of will lead me down the path to be able to get into that bad place? And I think I went through and looked at this, and a few different ones came up. And so I think I'm happy to share mine, but I think that for me, it's to think about, one, are these similar things that affect you as well? But also, what are your version of these? Because I think, great, we recognize that those fears are going to be there. They will always be there. I don't think you can get past it. I think you may be able to control it or minimize it, but they're always going to be there. So, okay. So what do we start to look at whenever we start to look at ourselves? And I think that, one of the big ones for me that I really struggle with is in looking at where that fear sort of comes from. I think one of the big ones for me is that really this idea that I'm in total control. And that for me, there really is that fact. Everyone will say, like, control is an illusion. And I think, look, we need to drop this illusion of that we can control everything. You can't control other people. You can't control the company or the world or to be able to do all of those things. Now, as we've talked about repeatedly on this show, all of this is about balance. Because, yes, you cannot control everything, but I think for me, I've started and have found a lot of success whenever I focus on the things I can control, the things that are in my sort of purview. Whenever I'm looking at this and saying, okay, look, what is it that I need to focus on? What do I need to get done? What is it that I can control? And to focus on that. Because then I can be productive. Then I can actually get something done. And that it isn't about having to control all these things, but it's understanding that, again, having a problem isn't the problem. How I respond to it, how I sort of, shift my focus and control my energy, that is what makes a really big difference. Now, I think the other part of this has really been this thinking as well that you can do all of this on your own. For me, this is the year of self-help is bullshit, right? No one can do all of this alone. No matter what accomplishments you've achieved, you can't go out and do it on your own, right? I think it takes a great team, a really good group of talented people. Like, you need, whether it's your support system, whether it's the team around you, whether it's somebody to talk to, whether it's any of those things, to be able to be successful. And I think sometimes it can get very easy to say, I need to do this, I'm the problem. And here again, it's about balance, where yes, you want to focus on what you can control. But I think it's also very important to quickly put the asterisk behind that again, you are not, by taking control, asked to do it alone. And I think one of the things that I've done here that I found really helpful was to just really look at who has contributed to your success. Whether it's people inside of your family or your parents, whether it's your significant other, whether it's friends, whether it's people you work with. Who are the ones who I think have been there for you, who you have helped, they have helped you, that there's been that really good give and take relationship there? Because I think that those are the people you have to make sure that you invest in, that there are times they're going to reach out to support you. There's times you need to reach out to support them. If it becomes a one-way street, yeah, definitely look at how do you maybe prune that tree a little bit or position them a little bit different. But to make sure that, again, you aren't just simply doing this all on your own. Because I think that does create an echo chamber where fear does a really good job of living. But I think a lot of it for us, too, is that I think we tend to do it with a real sense of urgency. Almost in feeling like we don't have enough time. Because, look, time is precious for everyone. But I think there's always a time, there's always this thing of sort of like, this little voice in the back of our heads, or definitely in mine, sort of telling me that I can't, do something, that I'm not going to be able to get there. It's not going to be as good as I want it to be. That, maybe if I just made an excuse, it would be easier. And I think that, again, that's where sort of that fear comes from, is that sometimes it's external forces and sometimes it's things we put on ourselves. And I think that in many cases that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy or a self-created problem, because one, I think if we just had a conversation or talked about or were more open with our process along the way, I think one, usually you aren't sort of getting backed into that corner, but I think often we need to create more focus. Like, one of the things I do is whenever I go into every week, I sit down and I prioritize what are the 3 things that I want to get done this week. And that those are the things, and I sort of set out how far do I want to get. Now, I know other things are going to come up. There could be derailers, there could be other things, but what I'm actively trying to do is to delegate, push back on, find another solution for things that don't focus on those 3 big things that I need to get done. Because here again, this is that balance of, while yes, you're going to be out of control and there are going to be other forces, at the same point, you need to be able to keep some part of this and some sort of focus there to really know what it is you're doing. Because I think if you don't do that, and if you don't do that sort of prioritization, then I think what you will often get into is this sort of feeling like, well, if I ignore it, it'll just somehow go away. And I think it's sad, but I think it's often true that there are times we still fall for this, and we still sort of trick ourselves into believing this, that most of the time what we ignore only grows bigger and becomes more cumbersome and becomes harder. And so for me, that ability to prioritize, to deal with those problems, to face the hard truth, to have the hard conversation, because if I just let it spin or spin out of control, it's just going to get worse. So I think that it really is one of those things that whenever it happens, I try to really deal with it. Because I think if you don't do that, and if you don't take on these things, if you refuse to confront them, I think over a fairly short amount of time, those things will control you. Because since you haven't engaged in it, you haven't looked at it, well, then it's going to try to impose itself more on you. I think that we also often have this feeling that as we're going through and doing this, that we understand what's best, right? We know what's best. And really, is that true? I think creativity is about learning. It's not about being right. And I think you won't know what's best, or you won't have the time, or you won't have all the answers. I think, for me, I can't tell you the number of times when I thought, oh, well, this is the sort of job I want. That's what's going to make me happy. And that wasn't close to being true. Good Lord, all the way down to like who I've been married to for 20 years. If you'd asked me 20 years ago who I'd be able to spend this much time with, I would have sat down and I would have written out a description, and all of it would have been wrong. We are our own biggest blind spot. We are full of biases and problems and all sorts of things that sometimes keep us from knowing maybe what's right. And so I think it really is here again about how do we focus on continuing to learn, to grow, to build that support system, to be able to not do those sort of things. Because I think if you think you have all the answers, then you probably are really overcompensating or don't at all. Right? Because I think you need to look around and see where you can ask more questions. Who can you ask for feedback more from? Find a little bit more humility to be able to do that. And I think also, or just give yourself a break, that you don't always have to have all the answers or to know what to do, that sometimes the plan doesn't have to be the answer. And, with a lot of this, I think that, it can be, because here again, it can be hard about how do I believe in myself and to be able to do that. But I think at the same point, to believe in myself but not to become egotistical about myself. And sometimes that's a hard distinction to make, because for me, nothing will destroy creativity, teamwork, or even a career faster than ego. And I think that it's hard to know, because I think, this entire show has been really dedicated to the debate around this fear and this approach of, on the one hand, how do you know your value? How do you stand up for yourself? How do you embrace being different, and how hard that is? But to never lose the humility in that process, to never lose and sort of tip so far that you really just feel like, oh, I've got all the answers. I know what it is I can do. I don't need the help. I don't have any fears. Because usually whenever I see anybody who acts like that, anybody who really overcompensates, maybe they have a really big personality, they push back, they have all the answers, they do all those things. I guess I've done this long enough and talked to enough people that I know that those people are the most insecure. It's a defense mechanism that they've built up to sort of keep people away, because for too many of us, but those people in particular, I think that they think that emotion is a weakness. And some people want to hold themselves beyond emotion to appear strong, right? Because they think like if you share what's going on, if you share a problem, then you're sharing your weakness. And that then you make yourself vulnerable and to be able to do that. And I would look at this a little bit differently. Because I think if you are vulnerable, now again, vulnerability is not for everybody. This isn't something where you just go out and take a billboard about how you're feeling. But I do think for me, and especially in this day and age, to show vulnerability more than anything is to show your strength. Because it is about humanity. It is about doing these sort of different things that the best people, the best leaders, the best creatives, I think the people who you want to spend time with, who you want to do great work with or do great work for, are ones who in some way make you feel understood. They touch your heart in some way. Because there's a humanity, there's an honesty, there's a willingness to sort of drop the corporate mask and to drop all of those sort of things to really just be able to have an honest conversation. And I think that for too many of us, that's what we get caught up in once again, is this invisible script of this sort of what we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to do or what we're supposed to act. And I think that's really, for me, what so much of this is about. Because as I think that you need to, if you think you need to be in control, if you think you can do it on your own, if you think that you don't have time, if you think that you can just ignore it or that you know best, or again, that you have all the answers, I think a lot of these for me and so many fears are based in, once again, these sort of scripts that we feel like we need to follow. Being the person that somebody else wants us to be. Being those sort of things of setting this expectation. In many cases that I don't necessarily think are real. These are dialogues that we are having inside of our head of places where we are holding ourselves back. Now, that's certainly not always true. Look, I've had plenty of bad bosses and bad teams and companies that lost their mind and other places like that where, again, I could have done all the self-reflection in the world and I don't think I'd have gotten any different results. But I think in many cases, that's what I would just ask you to do if this feels like something that you're going through, is just to take a minute and to think about those different sorts of fears. And then again, the different manifestations of, I think, where they often come from in our head. And just see which one of those really comes to life. Which one of those are real and which one of those are what we're projecting we think is going to happen. What is the worst that it could be? What are those sort of things versus did we try it and did that actually happen? But I think it also really is about just allowing yourself to go through that journey, to not do it alone, to see what it really is. Because ultimately, I think, the fear for me is, how do you get it to a place where you are comfortable being uncomfortable? How do you get to that place where you recognize that as you start to feel a certain way, that's actually probably even a good thing? Because it means you're pushing. It means you're trying. It means you're going to try to do something new, to do something different, to grow, to sort of action on that frustration or that unhappiness or sort of whatever it is, to try to move forward. There's always going to be stress there. There's always going to be fear there. There's always going to be uncomfort there because it's something new. Even if it's good change, it's going to be there. But I think that ability to be able to recognize that, to be able to figure out for you what are the right ways to push through it, to identify it, to talk to somebody, to be able to find your support, to be able to recognize that, again, in many of those cases, the thing that I'm going to bet that you're fearing, you're afraid of, you think that you can't expose to the world, I'm going to bet you can. And I'm going to bet a lot of people feel a really similar way, and you're going to be shocked whenever you say it that they do. I think this 4.5-year journey doing this show has proven that to me. I've talked about things on here I thought would end my career. I've talked about things on here that I've been afraid of, I've been hurt by, I've been upset by, I've learned from, and whatever it is. And having no idea of, are people really going to connect with that? Or are they going to laugh at me? Is it going to be useful? Or are they going to write it off as some egotistical person who just likes to hear himself talk, right? There's a lot of different ways. And I think we've talked about this before, but I think it bears repeating here again as sort of a final thought here. Success is a concept that only exists in hindsight. I think whenever you set off to do something, as you are going through it, as I've ever done anything that has even been remotely successful, it didn't feel successful in the moment. You weren't sort of like, yeah, this is going to be amazing. I think you maybe thought it was the right thing to do. You had a hunch. You felt like you were going the right direction. But I think we tend to forget the journey and just remember the outcome. And that for a lot of those sort of things, that then causes a real problem. Because then whenever we set off to do something, whenever we set off to try something, well, we want the feeling that we get at the end. And we forget what it was like along the way. And I think that's the thing to remember, is that when you get to the other side of it, then you can look back. Then you can see what the growth was. Then you can see what the success was. But the feeling at the end will not be the feeling along the way. There's going to be the fear and there's going to be the doubt and all of those sort of things. And so that would just be my ask, right? As I think to think about these things. And if you're feeling that frustration, if you're feeling those fears or feeling those uncertainties, to be able to just try in whatever way you can, to be able to move that forward a little bit, share a little more, try, just let something fly, just try something and see what happens. Because I think that's a lot of it for me in the coaching that I do or in the conversations that I have are with people who have these fears. But really, whenever we spend 30 or 60 minutes together having that conversation, what you can see at the end of it was I didn't really give them any advice. I didn't really say anything that I feel like honestly was probably all that smart. all that I really did was to validate what they already knew. They just wanted somebody else to tell them that it was a good idea, that what they were doing was the right thing, that they had the answer. They knew what they should do. They were just looking for somebody else to agree with them so that then they could push through that fear and to be able to get over it. So whether you're the person that wants to share that, to be able to help get through it, or whether it's something that you feel like you want to do more of to be able to help be the person who hears that and validates it for somebody. Because I think that's another thing for me that I've definitely learned is a great way to get over fear is to also realize you're not alone. So whether it's doing mentoring through something like the Amazing Design People List, whether it's going out and trying to help with like a local community group or sort of whatever it is, I think that's another way to really good way to get over fear is to realize that you're not alone in having it. But this is going to be an ongoing conversation, I'm sure, because again, I still think the effects of this pandemic are going to be with us for quite a while. But anyway, I think hopefully this is something that you can start to reflect on, you can start to think about, like I said, because it's just, this theme has come up in a lot of conversations lately, so it just felt like something I wanted to talk about here. But as always, so if you want to get the show notes to be able to have this refer back to, listen to other shows, things like that, you can always go and head over to thecrazy1.com. That's thecrazy and the number 1.com to check that out. You can tell I'm out of practice and how I'm struggling to do the close. Subscribe to the podcast and leave a review whenever you're there. Do me that favor. As always, everybody down here in legal wants me to remind you that the views here are just my own. They don't represent any of my current or former employers. And finally, I say it every time because I mean it every time, but thank you for your time. I know that time is truly the only real luxury any of us have. I'm always incredibly humbled that you want to spend any of it with me. And especially whenever we talk about an episode like this, around fear and trying to do something new, the closing feels even more relevant than usual. But hey, as always, stay crazy.